It's George from Ireland, and showing you this is a review of this Mad Mike Hoare, the legend, which is by his son, Chris Hoare. He's an extraordinary character, Mad Mike Hoare. I would have dearly liked to have met him, and he died 2.5 years ago, having lived to the age of 100. Not a savoury character, someone who killed without compunction, who sought out fighting, fair to say bloodthirsty. According to himself, he didn't carry out any atrocities. He did mutilate some of his men. He admitted having the big toe cut off both feet of one of his men, which he claims was a punishment for murder. That in this book says that he knew his men were pillaging people. He did nothing about that. Murder a civilian, yes, he would take action, but actually, armed robbery, no, he considered that permissible. And this is not just requisitioning things in wartime. In the United Kingdom might say Defence of the Realm Act. The government needs this because of the exigent situation, but you'll be compensated afterwards. No, 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 just taking it. Now he's a mercenary, but he was part of the Congolese army. The Congolese army had hired him, so you might say that was permissible. He's fighting for a recognised sovereign state, but even he called himself a mercenary, and his most famous volume of autobiography is entitled Congo Mercenary. So I don't want to tell you too much of his biodata, mainly reviewing this book. So he's born in Calcutta on St. Patrick's Day, 1919, to Irish parents. His father's a river pilot, as had been his grandfather and great grandfather had been pilots in Dublin. So although Michael was Irish, I don't think he ever lived in Ireland and seldom visited Ireland. In fact, he went to boarding school in England from the age of 8. He later identified with the Church of England. I don't know if he was brought up as Catholic or not. He started studying to be an accountant in the city of London just before the Second World War, and he joined the London Irish Rifles, which doesn't exist anymore. He fought in the Second World War, and he was a major by the end. He was there for 7 years. He was stationed in India in the Second World War, where he married an Englishwoman, Elizabeth Stott. They were blessed with 3 children. He's only 5'7" and spare, not a physically imposing man, had a fairly high-pitched voice, but was said to be every inch. The gentleman always impeccably turned out, spoken that sort of cut-glass accent that British officers in his era did. So was working as a chartered accountant in London just after the Second World War, and from chartered accountancy to mercenary activity, that is quite a leap. It reminds me of that sketch by Monty Python about what incredibly dull people they are. Now, I have to say, considering he's got an exceptionally coloured and checkered life, this is a rather bland book. I'm afraid his son doesn't do him justice. So you do get a notion of the man's character. I mean, I've watched the few YouTube clips there are of him. There's that film, The Wild Geese, came out in 1979, which is loosely based on him. And indeed, he called his formation the Wild Geese. That was their sobriquet, a reminder of 17th century Irish exiles who fought in various continental armies. And then he was an Irishman abroad, and he was also rabidly anti-communist. But that also led him to be, well, frankly, a white supremacist. I don't think he hated black people, but he certainly didn't think they should have equality in South Africa. Had really no compunction about upholding apartheid there, or seemed to think it was a good thing in Zimbabwe. He did work for black governments who at least paid lip service to the idea of freedom for black South Africans. What else about him? Yet he exclusively recruited whites into his units. Why the color bar? What's wrong with black people? Why can't black soldiers serve in his unit? They can be just as good as whites. They can be better than whites. Anyway, so there's at very least some patronising racialism in him. But this book, I mean, it's fairly spare. It's fairly sparse. What else can I say about it? I do want to read the books by the man himself. The reason I bought this one and not Congo Mercenaries, I thought, well, Congo Mercenaries is only about that one period in his life. I want to hear a lot about him. So you see you can see the chapters here. It takes you from his earliest childhood and through to his various ventures to trying to set up as a chartered accountant in Durban, South Africa, because he thought it was absolutely gorgeous place to live, and he was desirous of South African women, whites only again. And he had mixed success with that, becoming a car dealer, did very well in the motor trade, but he was bored rigid, so was a venturesome type and decided to be a condottiero. And in 1960s Africa, just as these colonial metropoles were liquidating their colonies, there were many opportunities for this, and he'd made money aplenty in this. I mean, first of all, actually not that handsomely paid in the Congo. He didn't do it particularly for the money, but later on he did get a large reward from Mobutu Sese Seko Koko Ngbendu Wazabanga, who was the president of Zaire, as it then was, from 1965 to 1997. And he'd driven a motorcycle all over Africa, things like that. There was a restlessness to him. And he said you get more out of life taking risks. He was also a yachtsman. But this book, it tells it in fairly bare terms. It's not as exciting as the man himself. There are quite a few anecdotes. I tell you what, the book has got pace. And it says how he was a bit of a Renaissance man. Mad Mike Hoare, who's not remotely insane, but his enemies called him, he was a mad jackal or something like that, a mad bloodhound, and then it stuck. I think it's also redolent of Mad Mitch, but Mad Mitch came afterwards. That was that British Army officer in charge of the Island Southern Highlanders in Aden, South Arabia, so we called it, in about the same period, fighting a losing battle in a sense. Or the British government decided to withdraw anyway. So what else about this? Yeah, it's got a few reasonable character sketches. I can say it's got some technical information, but yeah, it's not outstanding. It's not too dull, but it doesn't have as much on the actual Congo fighting as I would like. But yeah, it shows that Mad Mike Hoare, he had no compunction about killing people. I suppose you wouldn't be much of a soldier if you did. What else about him? He doesn't seem to have considered any justice of the other side, and talking about the atrocities the other side committed. No doubt some of those are true. Remember, William Howard Russell sticked in the first casualty of war is truth. So perhaps not all of these are true, maybe exaggerated. And look, it's got various photos of him as a child playing cricket, things like that. Onto there he is as an army officer getting married in India at the bottom of the page. So all that's quite appreciated. But it's a very, very different Africa he moved to in the late 1940s, whereas South Africa was just about the only developed country in Africa. There were very, very few cars. Outside the major cities, almost nobody had electricity, running water, things like that. Literacy was very, very low. And South Africa, he decided, was Europe in Africa, even though the whites were only a minority. So look, I'd fight for Rhodesia, as in he would uphold white minority rule there. So a very flawed figure, but a man who doesn't seem to have been had any conscience whatsoever about doing these kind of things. And what sort of desperados and cutthroats would sign up to his organization? People who'd left other armies and just sort of misfits who couldn't adapt to a peacetime society and want a lot of money. It's quite staggering that he should live to that age. And you see some videos of the behavior of a 5 Commando in Adio Africa, and taking completely healthy young men they've taken prisoners, or standing up, and it may seem silly, but just come across as nice guys. And one moment he's a healthy young man, maybe even a teenager, with decades ahead of him, and the next moment he's dead, just shot dead. But wow, I mean, I'm not a pacifist. I realize the right to kill people in combat, but I thought, you didn't have to kill him. You could have let him live. I know Mike Hoare would say, yes, but we couldn't guard these people. We have to be fast moving. We can't release them. Then we have lots of enemy in our rear, and they have intelligence on us. Anyway, so an absolutely merciless person. And it shows what an unjust world we live in, that he lived out the rest of his life in South Africa, lived sometime in France, but in comfort. And the South African government never prosecuted him for what he did. Staggering. Well, that's this. I mean, I can't say I recommend this book, even though the story itself is riveting, but the way it's delivered is sort of a mediocre manner. Right, thanks for watching. Goodbye.